challenging words, I hope, for some people in this room and some people on the panel. Now we're going to do something that too often print journalists don't really do. But first I'd like to point to an article that appeared in the Telegraph a week ago. It was written by Rebecca Brooks, a lawyer. He was arguing that because of the amount of information that's being revealed at the Leveson inquiry, there's a danger she and other journalists at the newspaper might not receive a free, fair trial. Which is incredibly ironic because of how they've treated other people who've been accused of crimes. And this is something that, as I was saying, we don't often get a chance to hear. But here's the voice of a person who's been in exactly that situation. Chris Jeffers.
Okay. I think I would say first that as part of a panel of genuine experts on the press, I feel something of an imposter. But what I've been asked to do really is tell a little bit of my own story and highlight what seem to me to be some of the most striking aspects of the press coverage of the case. And I hope perhaps, as a result, help to underline some of the issues relating to press standards and press regulation. I suppose you could say, if you think back to the events at the end of 2010 and the beginning of last year, including the murder of Joe Yates and my arrest, that there was something of a gift to the tabloid press, a kind of ready-made Midsummer Murders script set in an apparently respectable and leafy suburb. And if you just think for a moment first of the way in which the figure at the centre of this drama was presented, Jo Yates herself, the tragic victim. She was young, she was quite attractive, she was vulnerable, she was home-loving, she was at the start of what was apparently going to be an extremely successful career. She was just about to spend her first Christmas with her boyfriend. And all this was suddenly destroyed and her body callously dumped by the side of the road. So, evidently, we're looking for a depraved monster who is responsible for all this. And I was the person who had been arrested. And certainly the press seemed determined to believe both that the person who had been arrested was the genuine murderer and to portray me in as dark and as lurid a light as possible. And the first thing was that somebody remembered that 30-odd years before there had been an unsolved murder of another young girl, less than a quarter of a mile away. And, of course, I had been living in Clifton at that time. So there was some excitement that perhaps not only a murderer had been discovered, but somebody who was a serial murderer. And in fact, a couple of journalists were overheard speculating that it was very likely that they had unmasked a serial killer. And then secondly, it seemed likely, and in the event this turned out to be absolutely true, that there was a sexual motive for the murder. Now I think we all know how some of the less scrupulous journalists work. They'll talk to 100 people, and if 99 of them say one thing, and the 100 says something that they would prefer to believe, more than enable them to write the story that they want to write, then that's the one they will believe. Somebody perhaps who has an axe to grind, or who's hoping to be paid for the story. And 2 people were found, immediately anonymous, who had apparently suffered sexual harassment, and were entirely happy to insist that I was the person who had been guilty of that harassment. But we're talking about the tabloid papers here, so just to be a sexual predator is as pure and simple, is perhaps not spicy enough. The papers seem to want to have it in every possible way, and somebody discovered the most tenuous possible connection between me and somebody who'd been imprisoned for an offence with an underage boy. So the papers, of course, stressed that there was no evidence that I had been involved in this particular event, this particular offence. But simply by stressing that there was no evidence, they raised the possibility that I had paedophile tendencies. So, lo and behold, we don't just have a sexual predator, but we have now a bisexual predator. And all sorts of fantastic rumours were latched onto. That I would apparently hold pupils' hands while reading poetry, obviously with sinister sexual motives. And to complete the character assassination, it was alleged that I was fascinated by death because I happened to have, in fact, obsessed by death, simply because I happened to have shown on one or two occasions a particularly important documentary about the liberation of Auschwitz, a film that I'm sure has been shown here at the Arnold Feeney. So here you have me, this dark, macabre, sinister villain. And that certainly wasn't the whole of it. There were all sorts of other things. I was almost certainly prone to violent and uncontrollable outbursts of temper, for example. Now, it's quite interesting to think of the epithets that were used to describe Joe on one hand and me on the other. Joe was always the landscape architect, as if to reinforce her respectable credentials, and to underline the fact that here was a career tragically cut short. On the other hand, the caricature of me was of a lewd figure, a peeping Tom, was a repeated phrase I apparently spied on tenants, and a loner, simply because I happen to live alone. But even those papers couldn't entirely ignore the fact that a lot of people actually said some quite nice things about me, although those tended to be buried and not given very much prominence in the articles. And I thought very, very briefly, hope this won't appear in any way self-serving. I'm just going to quote a tiny couple of paragraphs from the article that Professor Brian Cathcart wrote about the whole affair towards the end of last year in the Financial Times magazine. He said, this hostile evidence was founded almost entirely on unnamed witnesses, with some of the most contentious quotations reproduced in several papers. A careful reader who relied only on quotes from people who were identified by name would probably have seen a very different picture. A former tenant, a friend, a former headmaster, a neighbour, who were described in various papers, though usually towards the end of articles, a man who was a dedicated teacher, a responsible landlord, and an active member of his community. Several expressed amazement at his arrest or downright disbelief at the idea of him killing anyone. Put these together with some readily available facts, and it would have been possible to flip the picture entirely. This man had taught for 34 years in a well-known independent school, leaving without a blemish on his record. He was involved in Neighbourhood Watch, the local Democrat Party, and a number of conservation campaigns. He had a large circle of friends, owned a handful of properties, was studying for a degree in French. As one neighbour put it, was a pillar of society. But editors did not give prominence to that interpretation. Instead, generally, the papers were so engrossed in their own witch hunt that they even ignored the warnings about contempt of court from the Attorney General. And as you know, two of them, the Sun, the Daily Mirror, were found to have been in contempt of court. And it's perhaps worth mentioning, because I'm not sure that it's been widely reported, that the paper which did actually petition the Supreme Court for leave to appeal against conviction, the Daily Mirror, their petition was dismissed by the Supreme Court only, I think, a week or two ago. Now, certainly I think mine was an extreme case, though by no means unique, but one of the things which did strike me was just how extraordinarily lazy and casually inaccurate the reporting was on almost every level, even down, just to give a couple of trivial examples, to things such as the geography of the house and the fact that the police were supposed to be ripping up floorboards when the flats in question had solid floors and there wasn't a floorboard in sight. Now, often the press, the relationship between the press and the police can be mutually beneficial, but because of the nature of the reporting in this case, it merely, I think, served to encourage the police in their belief that they may have caught the actual murderer. And certainly it was quite striking that during the interrogation of me while I was in custody, the police were particularly interested in some of these fantastical stories that were being reported. And perhaps the thing that I'd like to conclude by saying is that I'm repeatedly amazed at the remarkable insensitivity of some elements of the press to the damage that they cause. I was staggered to hear that the Leveson inquiry, a reporter admitted to the fact that he actually actively enjoyed hounding Diana, Princess of Wales. And I was similarly astounded that when the editor of the Scotsman, which was one of the papers that I sued, was asked about their paper's reporting of the whole affair, all he was able to say was, oh yes, well, we made a mistake.